They laughed at her backyard pond, at the crooked circle dug into raw dirt, the murky water that gathered with each rainfall, the plastic tarps she tried to weigh down with bricks. Neighbors shook their heads when they passed on evening walks, whispering that it looked more like a pit for mosquitoes than anything beautiful. Some even joked, not too quietly, that she was building a swamp to live in. She heard it all from her porch. The little snickers carried across fences, rising above the hum of lawnmowers and the bark of restless dogs. They wanted her to feel foolish, and sometimes she did. But each morning she stood there anyway, staring at that patch of water with the stubborn belief that it mattered, even if she couldn't explain why. To most people, it was just a hole. To her, it was more like a mirror. She had always been the quiet one, never fully invited into the rhythms of the neighborhood. Where others kept their yards neatly clipped, hers had corners that grew wild, lined with stones she collected from long drives. When they tamed their spaces, hers unraveled a little. She didn't see mess. She saw possibility. The pond was only the latest of those possibilities. The ridicule came sharpest during its early days, when wind scattered leaves across the water and the surface turned brown with algae blooms. More than once, she caught her reflection at dusk and wondered if they were right, that maybe all she had done was ruin a yard. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to drain it or fill it back in. She watched dragonflies hover. She watched the moonlight catch in faint rings. She felt a pull that sat deeper than pride, as though the water was waiting for something no one else believed. The gossip pressed her further to the edges, a woman wasting time, a woman who should have kept things plain. She didn't fight back with sharp words. Instead, she carried bags of sand, lined the rim with flat stones, and kept shaping the pond slowly, quietly, as if each day's work sealed a promise that the ridiculed could not see. One autumn evening, as the air cooled and the crickets thinned, she stood listening and noticed something strange. The water made a sound she couldn't name. Not simply the wind brushing the reeds, a low, rhythmic ripple, as though something beneath had shifted its weight. She leaned close. The surface smoothed, then tugged outward, almost like breath. The moment was gone before she could blink, leaving her both unsettled and curious. She told no one. They wouldn't believe her anyway. She carried the secret inside, watering her silence the way she watered the last flowers near the rim. Somewhere in the muddied depth, movement had stirred. Something kept its pace on a rhythm not quite hers. It would be easy to call this wishful thinking, the way lonely hearts sometimes find meaning where others see nothing. And maybe at first it was. But soon even the skeptics would have to admit that she had been right to listen. Because the laughter aimed at that strange little pond was drowning out a truth only patience could uncover. While they walked by smirking, sipping iced tea, and asking why anyone would want a mess like that in a neat row of houses, the water was beginning its quiet work. From its dim edges, new shapes emerged, shapes that the eye might dismiss as shadows, but that would not stay shadows for long. So the laughter rose. But none of them knew. None of them understood that the whole time they were cracking jokes about the ugly pond, a small and extraordinary secret had already taken root deep in its stillness. A secret so rare that soon scientists would have no choice but to gather, measure, and try to give it a name. Here's the thing. Sometimes the most unbelievable discoveries don't start in shining labs or faraway jungles. They begin the opposite way, with a person no one takes seriously and a patch of ground no one else wants. That was her story. This forgotten pond, mocked and dismissed, was about to change from a neighborhood joke into the birthplace of something the whole world had never seen before. And all she had to do was keep waiting by the water. When she first imagined the pond, it wasn't supposed to be anything strange at all. She just wanted a place to sit quietly, a patch of water that could soften the hard edges of her days. Some people dream of faraway trips. She dreamed of filling her backyard with the sound of frogs at dusk. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about creating calm in a world where she often felt overlooked. She could see it clearly in her mind the day she started digging. A circle, not too large, edged with stones she collected from roadside embankments. She pictured lilies stretching their leaves across the surface, the kind she'd once admired during a walk in a nearby park. And she wanted the kind of reflection ponds hold, sky mirrored in water, clouds drifting in silence. That vision mattered more to her than how others judged it. But from the very start, the neighborhood looked on with suspicion. Shoveling through hours of dirt seemed strange when others were hiring landscapers to trim hedges into perfect lines. Some paused mid-dog walk to stare. One man said, half under his breath but loud enough to sting, "Guess she's opening a swamp." Another chuckled, "Wait till the mosquitoes move in." Their laughter felt sharp, clipped like the grass they fussed over every weekend. She wiped sweat from her face and returned to digging. What they saw as a mess, she saw as foundation. The ground was heavy, her back aching, but each shovel of dirt seemed to push her vision forward. Where they saw ugliness, she felt the slow shaping of peace. And the more they mocked, the more determined she grew to finish. Inside her small house, loneliness rested in the corners. She had no partner to split chores with, family she seldom spoke to, friends who had moved away years ago. What remained to keep her steady were these self-built projects, routines no one else controlled. That pond slowly became a companion. She whispered to it in the evenings, confiding without expecting reply. Water doesn't talk back, but somehow it listens. Her resilience baffled the neighbors. By early spring, the pond was lined with plastic sheeting from the hardware store, weighed down with stones, edges rough but functional. She filled it bucket by bucket, carrying water from the spigot in a rusted pail. It looked odd for weeks, half complete, the sheeting flapping in wind, the stones scattered unevenly. The gossip thickened. "Doesn't she know you can buy a pre-built water feature?" Someone laughed. Another added, "Some people just don't know when to quit." She heard those words and carried on. Days turned to nights. Her hands blistered, then healed. She arranged the flat stones until the rim looked like an embrace. She planted reeds at one edge, imagining them taller with each season. By midsummer, a small ecosystem had formed. Rainwater mixed with earth, insects drawn to the shimmer, stray leaves caught around the rim. It wasn't pretty by magazine standards, but it was alive. And in that rough aliveness, she felt something stirring, a kind of quiet gratitude. She sat by its edge with tea, listening to crickets, and thought, maybe this is what belonging feels like. Not being invited into neighborhood barbecues, not being praised for neat hedges, but watching water gather in a hole she made, knowing it was hers. Still, her outsider status deepened. The pond became a marker people used to define her. "She's odd," they said, "always tinkering with that puddle." Children teased as they rode past on bikes, calling out, "Watch out! Don't fall in the swamp!" She smiled faintly, but inside felt the sting. The truth was, she did want company, but she wasn't willing to abandon what she loved just to fit in. So she began writing in a notebook. At first, just sketches of how she wanted the edges to look once the reeds grew tall. Soon, the notes shifted into records. When dragonflies hovered, when frogs appeared, when strange patterns rippled across the surface without wind. Observations that mattered only to her. She didn't realize it then, but those quiet notes would one day provide the first map to a discovery no one could dismiss. The work continued, even when the mockery cut deepest. In winter, when the pond froze over in a thin sheet of glass, her neighbors scoffed again. "Told you it would be useless," one woman said, as she salted her driveway. But the pond, though frozen, looked beautiful to her, like stillness captured. She traced the ice with her glove and whispered, "Not useless. Just waiting." Waiting for what, she couldn't have said. Her mind resisted naming it, but deep inside she carried a thread of faith, as if the pond itself had chosen her to make space for what lay unseen. By the second spring, the backyard looked transformed. The pond was still imperfect, edges awkward, plastic sometimes showing through, but reeds had begun to stretch taller, curling at tips. New insects danced on the water. Birds visited more often, pecking at tiny movements below. From her porch, she watched each shift, like a chapter unfolding, and though the neighbors still shook heads, their laughter grew mixed with curiosity. Some slowed their steps longer, trying to make sense of why she persisted. Others dismissed it outright, clinging to the easy story of eccentricity. She lived with their opinions brushing past her like wind. What mattered was that her pond lived. The gossip could not erase that soft fact, nor could it erase the stillness she felt when dusk colored the water. In those moments, the mockery seemed far away. She looked into the pond and felt seen in return. And soon, changes under the surface suggested her stubbornness carried more weight than anyone had imagined. The pond was beginning to behave not like decoration, but like something unknown, a quiet stage where ordinary rules bent just slightly. The laughter around her never guessed what she was beginning to witness. But like ripples across its surface, truth was spreading outward, too subtle, yet too steady to ignore. At first, the pond seemed to settle into a rhythm, the way any pool of water might after time. Rain fell into it, leaves decayed in its corners, insects traced their loops across the surface. But then she began to notice little things that didn't quite fit. One evening, near the start of summer, as the sky dimmed, she saw the water take on a faint band of color. Not the simple shimmer of sunset across a calm pool. This was deeper, like ribbons of green and violet shifting just under the surface, weaving around in slow circles. She blinked and leaned closer, heart racing. When she rubbed her eyes and looked again, the colors had dimmed back into nothing but shadow. Maybe it was a trick of light, she thought. Yet something about it lodged in her chest, difficult to dismiss. The colors returned again a few days later. This time, she was sitting with a cup of tea, notebook balanced on her knee. The pond was quiet. Dragonflies perched. Then the bands returned, pulsing faintly, rolling in patterns no reflection could explain. She wrote down the exact time, the weather, even the direction of the wind. Her handwriting came faster, tighter, because a thought stirred. Something beneath was alive in a way she had never seen. She tried speaking of it once, lightly, to a neighbor who stopped by the fence with her dog. "I've been noticing odd lights in the pond at night," she said. The woman gave a flat smile and shrugged. "Maybe your eyes are playing tricks. Water does funny things when it's dirty." Then came the laugh, sharp and short as a slammed door. After that, she decided to stop sharing. But the pond didn't let her rest. Soon came the sounds. She would be inside, drifting off to sleep, when a faint ripple-like hum carried through the open windows. Not the croak of frogs, not the whine of insects, softer, rhythmic, as though a hidden pulse beat through the water. She would lie awake, listening, straining to catch its pattern. Sometimes it rose into a series of clicks, almost like marbles tapping the rim of glass jars. Then it fell away again, leaving silence too heavy to ignore. The ridicule outside only grew. One morning, while trimming hedges, a man announced to the group around him, "She's raising pond monsters back there." They chuckled, muttering "swamp lady," as though the nickname would stick. She heard it from her porch and simply turned her gaze back to the water. Every sting from their mouths pressed her further into her secret. The truth was beginning to diverge from the story they painted. Still, she could not deny the strangeness unsettled her, too. Sometimes, at dusk, she watched the surface ripple without any breeze. Small circles spread outward, faint at first, then stronger, as though a stone had been dropped, though she had seen no movement above. The reeds bent gently, yet no animal stirred them. She hunched closer, clutching her notebook, scribbling the times. Was it pressure rising from below? Was it something burrowing into the new home she had created? She couldn't say. But when she placed her hand close to the water, she swore the temperature shifted in pockets, warm in one spot, cool in the next. All the same, she felt an odd pride building. Each log in her notebook stole power away from the laughter across the fences. She wasn't just playing at a pond anymore. She was watching, recording, waiting for a pattern to unfold. Some nights, she left a small lantern near the edge and sat for hours, hoping the colors or clicking would resurface. The neighbors muttered more rumors then, pointing at the glow late at night. But she grew too curious to care. Her body began to know the rhythm as well. Just before midnight, she would wake without reason, drawn toward the back door. Stepping quietly, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, she'd watch the pond breathe fog into the cool air. Sometimes the surface trembled as if stirred from within. A shape swam across in the darkness, but never quite revealed itself. She would grip the porch rail tight, heart quivering between fear and wonder. By the second month of these events, her notes filled 50 pages. Times, sketches, tiny arrows pointing to curves in ripples. She tried describing the glow in words, though language faltered. She knew, though, that these records would matter one day, even if to no one but herself, because each whisper, each tremor in the surface told her she hadn't built just a pond. She had built a threshold. Then, one weekend, something shifted. A pair of children chasing a ball through the street stopped at her fence. One peered through the slats. "What's that in the water?" the boy asked. She turned quickly. The pond rippled faintly, though she had thrown no stone. The girl wrinkled her nose. "It smells weird." They ran off laughing, already mocking before they reached the end of the block. And yet one phrase stuck in her ears. "What's that in the water?" They had seen something after all. That same night, she noted brighter glimmers deep in the mud. Not reflections, something almost bioluminescent, flickering softly, then vanishing. Her pen dug hard against the paper. She whispered aloud what she hadn't dared before. Something lives here. If she had been able to share her notes with someone who believed, they might have named her sightings as anomalies of ecosystems forming. But standing alone, she carried both the burden and the wonder. It wasn't just algae, no matter how many times the neighbors spat out that word. These patterns had intention. She could feel it growing steadier each week, and soon fate began to shift. Because not everyone would laugh forever. Curiosity has a way of traveling farther than scorn. One passerby, someone different from the usual group of mocking neighbors, paused longer at her fence line, watching the ripples with furrowed brows. That was the first sign she wasn't imagining at all. Her world, once crowded by ridicule, was opening just slightly. She didn't know it then, but that chance moment would be the beginning of her discovery bleeding into other lives. The pond, once reduced to a punchline, had built its own story, line by line. Lights, clicks, ripples, warmth. Enough mystery to spin her quiet notes into a strange kind of testimony. And, like a stage waiting for curtain rise, it prepared for its next act. Because chance was about to usher someone unexpected into her yard. Someone who didn't laugh. Someone who looked and saw what she had been seeing all along. It was a warm afternoon when the stranger appeared. She had been trimming back reeds by the pond's edge, sweat soaking her sleeves, when she noticed a young figure lingering near the fence line. At first, she braced herself, another neighbor's child ready to heckle. But this one didn't laugh. He stepped closer, hesitating with a kind of focused attention she hadn't seen before. "Excuse me," he said finally in a voice both shy and direct. "I was walking by, and something in your water moved funny. Do you mind if I look closer?" His words startled her, not mocking, not a joke. She nodded slowly, unsure whether to trust this moment. He stepped through the open gate with the carefulness of someone who knew how often doors had been closed to him, too. His backpack tugged low, patches stitched across it, marking him as someone who studied things, not simply passed by them. Kneeling at the edge, he peered into the pond with a stillness that almost mirrored her own. Then he glanced up. "This doesn't look like standard algae," he murmured. "There's movement layered in the pattern." She tilted her head, surprised. The way he spoke carried certainty. No joke, no smirk, just observation, as if he was used to framing his thoughts in scientific phrases. She asked softly, "You study biology?" He nodded. "Yes, I'm in college nearby. Field ecology is my focus. I take long routes home just to keep my eyes open for unusual systems. And this," he gestured to her pond, "this doesn't behave like any simple backyard pool." The words made her grip her knees tight. For months, she'd convinced herself she might be imagining, stretching her loneliness into stories. To hear a stranger confirm, without hesitation, that something unusual was here nearly stole her breath. The student leaned closer, pulling a small notebook from his pack the way she herself often did. He scribbled quickly, watching how the pond rippled even though no pebble had dropped. He tapped his pen. "You see how the waves overlap? It's more patterned than random." His voice lowered. "Something is generating it." She stepped beside him, the two of them crouched, shoulder to shoulder at the rim. For the first time, she spoke the words out loud. "I've seen lights at night." His eyes sparked. Lights? Bioluminescence? Where? Near the bottom. Flickering. Faint. Like... She searched for a comparison. Like fireflies underwater. He nodded slowly, taking it in as fact, not fantasy. Then he slipped a small, clear vial from his bag. "Would you mind," he asked gently, "if I take a sample? Just a small one, no harm done." Her instinct clashed between protectiveness and longing. Part of her wanted to shield the pond from intrusion, but stronger was the ache to be believed, to have her notebooks validated. She gave a small nod. "Go ahead." He crouched lower, dipping the vial into the shallows. Sunlight struck the water as it swirled inside. When he held it up, faint motes shimmered in suspension. Not dirt, not simple silt. Small shapes shifted, curling almost deliberately. His brows furrowed. "These structures," he whispered, "they don't match common larvae. I don't recognize the morphology at all." She leaned closer to glimpse through the glass. For a second, one of the motes pulsed faintly, an echo of the light she had seen glowing in the depths. She inhaled sharply. He caught her reaction and nodded. "You weren't imagining it." "There's something new here." Her body seemed to loosen all at once, months of secrecy and ridicule dissolving into one fragile thread of hope. Somebody else had seen. Somebody else knew. They sat together for an hour, talking in splashes and pauses. She showed him her notebooks, the pages filled with sketches, times, notes about colors and hums at midnight. He flipped through them reverently. "These are detailed. You've built field logs more consistent than half the labs I've seen." She flushed, unused to praise. "It was just for myself." "No," he said firmly. "You collected valuable data. Data that could map something undiscovered." For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what it might mean. That her long nights by lantern light, scribbling shaky sketches, hadn't been futility, but groundwork toward a real discovery. Yet, together with hope, came worry. She murmured, "If word spreads, what if others laugh harder? Or worse, tear it apart, just to prove me wrong?" He shook his head. "Science doesn't begin with community opinion. It begins with observation, and you've observed something real." Before he left, he placed the vial carefully back in his pack. "I'll analyze this under the scope at my university," he said. "I can't promise anything yet, but..." He smiled faintly. "Don't let anyone call this pond useless again. What you've created is extraordinary." Her eyes filled, a rush of emotions she kept pressed down spilling over. She managed a quiet "thank you," voice trembling, but he seemed to understand. That evening, after he walked away toward roads leading farther than she'd traveled in years, she sat by the pond alone again. Yet it no longer felt like solitude. His belief lingered in the air, woven into the ripples. That night, she didn't hide her lantern behind reeds. She set it proudly at the pond's edge, letting its glow span out. When faint glimmers stirred beneath, the shy flickers of life still nameless, she didn't question whether they were real. She had a witness now. As the neighbors passed, some eyes lingered, curious why she remained awake again beyond midnight. She let them look. Their laughter stung less than before, shielded by the memory of a young man kneeling, eyes widened with wonder, declaring it extraordinary. And deep in the pond, tiny creatures moved beneath her gaze. They had lived quietly, through months of disbelief. waiting for a moment when someone from beyond her fence would finally recognize them. That moment had arrived. A door had opened, not just for her validation, but for the pond's hidden truth to stretch into the broader world. She sat straighter, spine against the porch rail, heart humming with anticipation, because now, for the first time, she wasn't alone. The ripples carried not just mystery, but promise. Promise that the secret she had guarded through ridicule had finally begun to speak beyond her walls. Promise that the world outside, through one curious visitor, was finally ready to listen. News rarely travels far in a quiet neighborhood, but word of that student's visit did. The next morning, a few neighbors leaned over their fences, whispering while pretending to rake. Their voices carried the same mocking tone she had grown used to, only sharpened now with curiosity. "She's got college kids digging in her puddle," one man smirked. Another replied, "Guess she pays them to make it seem important." The old laughter rose again, but it trembled with the edge of something new, a tension they didn't fully understand. Meanwhile, the young student carried that small vial away and could not stop thinking about it. Inside the liquid, under his scope, he began to see movements that defied what he had studied. Strange cellular structures, unlike standard algae, flexed as though reacting to light. He returned days later, more polite than before, to ask if he could take additional samples. She agreed, though nervous. His careful hands lowered another vial into the pond, preserving fragments of its hidden life. Soon, his excitement reached others. Not professors yet, but classmates, hungry for discovery. They asked questions, pored over crude sketches of organisms pulsing with light. Some scoffed, but some raised brows, intrigued. "If that's true," one remarked, "it doesn't match any entry I've seen in the local field catalogs." The idea that their colleagues' find could hint at something undocumented pushed them from skepticism into action. Within a week, 3 students convinced a faculty member to at least come see. Back in the small town, the whispers grew louder. People shook their heads at the sight of strangers in her yard, crouched around what they still called her swamp. "Unbelievable," muttered one neighbor. "All this fuss for a puddle." They gathered in clusters at dusk, watching as visiting figures leaned over notebooks and equipment. "It's embarrassing," said another, almost offended, "to think outsiders think there's anything new in a hole she dug." But within her, sparks of hope lit. For months, the ridicule had been hers alone to carry. Now, each new visitor bent close to the surface, recording ripples and collecting readings that echoed her own quiet logs. For the first time, she wasn't the only one believing. Her pond had voices testifying on its behalf. The researchers began to notice repeating patterns. On warm evenings, faint pulses of light shimmered below the surface, each lasting a few seconds before vanishing. Small recording devices picked up soft clicking underwater, timed, consistent, not random as frogs or insects. They noted her observations too, impressed by her detailed entries. "You have essentially been building baseline data," one remarked. She blushed, unused to being spoken to with such respect. Not all were convinced, of course. A professor who visited briefly shook his head. "Likely bacterial colonies reflecting under certain conditions," he said, dismissively, snapping his notebook closed. The neighbors pounced on this soundbite, using it to double their laughter. "See? Not special at all. Just slime." They celebrated the interpretation, comforting themselves with the easier story. Nothing extraordinary could happen in their backyard. Yet the smaller group of younger scientists refused to walk away. They shared samples secretly among themselves, whispering late in labs, stunned by what microscopes revealed. "Look at this," one whispered, showing a slide where microorganisms swirled not randomly, but in what looked like coordinated spirals, like flocks of birds underwater. Another noted unusual proteins that didn't align with catalogs. Skepticism met observation, and doubt gave way to wonder. She could only imagine what they saw by the glimmer in their eyes when they returned to her porch. They spoke carefully, cautious not to raise false hope, but they kept coming back. "We need more time," one told her. Another leaned forward, whispering low so neighbors wouldn't hear. "Promise you'll keep watching. This may matter more than you know." Her rejection by the community pressed just as hard. On one walk to the store, she overheard two women say, "She's crazy if she thinks scientists will waste time on her mess." Their laughter stung like always. But this time she held a quiet shield inside. She had seen the students' intensity, the way they whispered excited, frantic phrases about structures and patterns. She knew they weren't wasting their time. They had chosen to return again and again. That told her everything. Nights grew brighter in her yard. Lanterns glowed by the pond as students carefully photographed ripples, adjusting lenses clumsily in the dark. Neighbors grumbled about lights disturbing their sleep. Yet she stayed outside with them, a blanket on her shoulders, proud to lend warmth to those who saw what she had always felt. Her pond, once only a mirror of loneliness, was now a gathering ground for curiosity. And still, the discovery unfolded slowly, deliberately. When they compared their recordings, unusual patterns emerged. Timed flashes in the water that seemed coordinated, almost like communication, whispered one. They didn't dare say more, knowing how absurd it might sound, but inside each of them, the weight of possibility pressed. Something here had yet to be written down. Her own notes deepened in detail, guided by their questions. She logged temperatures, moon phases, even the times neighborhood dogs barked without clear reason. She measured soil dampness, checked fishless corners for life. The students praised her discipline, saying her records might be essential one day. She felt her cheeks warm at their words. For so long she had been the butt of jokes. Now she was part of their team. Meanwhile, resentment swelled across fences. "She thinks she's a scientist now," scoffed one man, strutting with notebooks like she knows something. Yet his bitterness cracked with nervousness. Beneath his sneer was the unsettling truth. People with real expertise were finding value in what he mocked. The laughter came louder, not because of certainty, but because of fear that they had underestimated her quiet backyard. And so two realities collided, the ridicule outside and the reverence inside her gate. With each day, the gap widened. To her neighbors, nothing had changed. Just a stubborn woman with dirty water luring gullible kids. But to the small circle of researchers, that water shimmered with questions they could not place. One evening, as she sat with the group, huddled close to the pond's edge, she looked around at their intent faces glowing by lantern light and thought, "This is what belief feels like." It was fragile, yes, and the world outside would scoff louder than ever. But for the first time she felt part of something beyond herself, a thread that stretched from her lonely notes into scientific eyes, building a chain of wonder that nothing could break. And soon, proof would come, not just whispers, not just flickers on slides, but concrete findings that even doubters could not deny. The ripples of attention had begun. They were small, steady circles spreading outward. What started as one student's curiosity was now reaching labs, conversations, and papers. And with each passing week, her backyard pond carried more weight than any neatly trimmed lawn around her. The laughter continued, but its ring grew thinner, because beneath it, truth was rising. And that truth was stronger than scorn. It was evidence, shimmering quietly in the water, waiting for courage to name it. No matter how many times she reminded herself that ridicule was louder than truth, the tension of waiting pressed heavy. The small team of students kept returning, their eyes bright with unspoken theories, their instruments clicking softly at the pond's edge. Each visit felt like a breath drawn deeper, a step closer to the answer she had felt all along. But now, concrete results were emerging, fragile and firm at once, stepping out of mystery into measured language. One evening, a student unfolded a laptop beside the lantern light. He angled the screen toward her. "We ran analysis," he whispered, as if fearing the night air might snatch the words away. Grainy microscope images filled the screen. At first glance, they resembled clusters of familiar microorganisms. But then she noticed the strange, deliberate shapes. Their bodies curved into spirals, linked, almost forming tiny chains. Each cluster quivered in sequence, as though responding to some inner music. "These aren't cataloged anywhere," he continued. "We compared them against major reference databases. Closest relatives exist, but only distantly. The gene markers don't match any known genus. That means..." He trailed off, watching her eyes widen. "It means they're new," she murmured. Her fingers trembled against her notebook. For months she had scribbled in silence, doubting herself every time the neighbors' laughter echoed. And now the shapes on the screen provided the first undeniable proof that she had not been wrong. The others gathered around. One pointed toward the image. "Look at their bioluminescent proteins. They don't behave like dinoflagellates or common glowing plankton. It's novel." Another added, "See their symmetry? It's coordinated. Biological architecture like this suggests a whole new branch." Their voices tingled with excitement, layered over awe. She pressed her palms flat on her knees, grounding herself as her backyard shifted beneath her. Just days ago, the pond had been scorn. Tonight, under lantern glow, it became a laboratory of wonder. Yet the discovery brought its own weight. Skeptical voices still surrounded her yard. The professor who dismissed it as bacteria reported back to colleagues, shaking heads at students indulging a woman's fantasy. In the grocery store parking lot, she caught hostile stares. One neighbor smirked, "How much is she paying those kids to pretend?" Their distrust thickened like weeds. But truth has a strange way of silencing mockery over time. The students doubled down, careful with every step, eager to protect both the pond and their credibility. They repeated experiments to confirm results. They sealed samples properly, storing them for independent labs. "We're cautious," one assured her. "We need to be certain before we say anything loud." She nodded, appreciating their balance. For weeks, she had dreamed of vindication, but she also feared premature claims. If the world brushed this aside, the laughter would return sharper than before. Better to wait until nothing could be denied. The nights stretched long. Lanterns glowed, soft reflections rippling across the pond's surface, while they measured variables: oxygen content, temperature variation, nutrient levels. Every data point confirmed one strange reality. This pond's micro-ecosystem evolved differently than others. Perhaps it began as an accident of soil and water. Perhaps migrating spores had found the perfect cradle. Whatever the origin, She realized she had unwittingly built a pocket of unseen life. The scientists whispered of publications, of peer review. She barely grasped their jargon, but the undercurrent was clear. Her pond mattered. Hidden within the muddy edges, mocked as a swamp, a new species had surfaced into their lenses. Still, she carried herself quietly. She rose in the mornings, brewed tea as always, trimmed reeds slowly. Neighbors clucked behind fences, muttering that the strangers had wasted yet another evening. She let them think so, wearing her silence like armor. Their laughter bounced hollow now, failing to land against the truth blooming in her backyard. One night, as dusk folded in, she sat beside the pond alone again, quiet after the students left. She leaned close, the reeds swaying in the whispering wind. A faint glow rose beneath the water, brighter than before, threads of gentle light weaving upward, pulsing like veins alive with blood. She watched in awe, no longer frightened. This wasn't random. This was life, asserting itself softly but undeniably. She whispered aloud, though no one could hear. "You're real. You've always been real." When the next round of results arrived, they confirmed what her heart already knew. The sequencing data came back with differences too distinct to ignore. These organisms did not fit existing taxonomies. They bore the marks of something unseen, unrecognized. They don't just add detail to what we know, one student explained. They expand the map itself. For her, those words reached deeper than science. They expanded her map, too. The lonely margins where she had been pushed now extended into possibility. She wasn't just the odd woman with a swamp. She was the caretaker of a discovery destined to change more than her yard. Yet, strangely, she felt no desire to shout it from rooftops. Instead, she found herself protecting it. Each ripple, each glow was fragile, tender, deserving care beyond human pride. If the world was about to look her way, she wanted the pond itself respected. Of course, the neighbors had no idea. Their laughter kept coming, even meaner when they saw the students packing clipboards. "Guess the science fair's in her yard now," someone joked. Another rolled their eyes. "Just slime, folks. Nothing worth all this drama." But truth is patient, and sometimes truth blooms in the water long before voices above it catch up. Slowly, national curiosity stirred. Not headlines yet, not papers in major journals, but murmurs among the scientific community. Researchers beyond the local university heard about odd new samples that refused to fit known records. Plans for larger studies took shape. She stood at the edge of her pond, reeds brushing her palms, listening to those whispers ripple outward. Her notebook pages fluttered in the breeze, filled with months of raw observations that now carried weight. Where once she wrote to ease loneliness, she realized she had written the foundation of a scientific record. This was the moment she had been waiting for, though she never could have described it. The laughter of neighbors stretched on, but so did the glowing lights below the water's skin. Only now, those lights had witnesses. They had names in the making, sequences coded, papers underway. The discovery had been unseen for so long, but not anymore. Even while the world beyond her fence denied it, the truth was sealed in vials, imprinted in genetic trails, and destined for recognition. The pond, small and mocked, had grown larger in meaning than anyone yet grasped. She closed her notebook that night with steady hands. The laughter might echo another day, but she knew it now. The water itself had spoken. Something new lived here. and everyone would soon have to hear it. The first printed words about her pond appeared not on glossy pages or big headlines, but in a slim preliminary report quietly shared among scientists. For her, it was the loudest validation she had ever received. The students had worked with their professors to draft an abstract, measured, precise, cautious. It didn't claim miracles. It didn't declare revolutions. It simply described unusual findings, anomalous organisms that suggested they may represent a distinct lineage. To her, those words were everything. For the first time, the strange movements she had seen with her own eyes were translated into language others were forced to respect. But when the murmurs reached the neighborhood, the ridicule didn't die. Instead, it flared. At a cookout just down the street, people chuckled over grilled meat. "Did you hear they're calling her slime new?" one smirked. "Guess muck in a ditch is news now." Another voice chimed in. "Whole town is going to be embarrassed, hanging our name on algae." Laughter carried on warm air like smoke. She caught fragments walking back from the store, her arms full of groceries, face hot though the evening was cool. Inside her home, she sat trembling on the edge of her chair, staring at the faint glow through the curtains. The pond had become both her salvation and the source of every dagger aimed from outside. Ridicule had never bothered her to this degree before, but now the sharpness grew stronger because she knew the truth. It wasn't slime. It wasn't muck. This time, she had proof. The students assured her that real peer review might take months, maybe longer, but they urged her not to despair. "They'll laugh until the paper passes," one said gently. "Then they'll try to pretend they always knew." Another added more bluntly, "Skeptics laugh loudest before proof pulls their tongues still." Their words calmed her for a moment, but the sting of daily whispers remained. Supermarket aisles filled with muttered comments, passing cars slowed, teasing about Madam Muddy Waters, a nickname someone had stuck on her lawn. Despite the cruelty, she felt her core hardening like iron. Each jeer bounced against the image of those glowing spirals under a scope, the data columns lined with differences no skeptic could erase. Science didn't bend to gossip. Science kept its own ledger. Meanwhile, the researchers pressed forward. They expanded their methods, measuring reproductive rates, stress responses, protein analysis. Each result layered on the same conclusion. These organisms didn't fit categories. Not like algae, not like fungi, not like the single-celled flagellates documented nearby. They were genetically distinct, with patterns so unusual that senior faculty stopped dismissing them outright. Still early, professors might warn, but intriguing. That word, intriguing, echoed in her mind each night. To call something intriguing was the scientific version of awe-restrained. The day the report circulated more broadly, she sat on her porch, notebook in her lap. Cars slowed. Neighbors whispered, their laughter harder, trying to drown the ripple of change surfacing. One man called across the fence, "So what's next? Naming the swamp after you?" His buddies laughed. She nodded quietly, refusing to give them the satisfaction of flinching. Inside, she whispered to herself, "Yes, maybe one day." Word began to leave the circle of science, leaking into local press. A radio station picked up a rumor, calling her pond the subject of debate, miracle or mistake. Hosts chuckled, leaning toward mistake. Newspaper articles framed her as eccentric. "The woman with the backyard swamp who thinks she's discovered life." She listened late into nights, rolling those words across her tongue. Eccentric, swamp, mockery disguised as coverage. Yet tucked within each piece was the unavoidable line, "Researchers confirm novel findings remain under review. That line mattered. She had dreamed of quiet peace, not national eyes, and yet the pond had chosen otherwise. She often sat back, tea cooling in her hand, wondering if she had built destiny by accident, digging with her rusted shovel all those months ago. The ridicule pressed hardest when small TV crews arrived. Curious producers lined up at her fence, cameras peering through. She refused most requests, feeling protective, but the neighbors seized on it. "See," one cried. "She called them herself." Others nodded knowingly, a chorus of suspicion. Each broadcast painted her in odd lights: recluse, hobbyist, strange woman insisting slime was special. She turned down interviews, worrying that speaking would only taint the truth. Let the data talk. Let the science push forward. One evening, sitting alone beside the dark pond, she lifted her face to the dim sky. The hum of insects layered with faint water sounds. In her chest swelled both ache and pride. They could laugh louder than ever, the whole town united in ridicule stronger than before. But none of their voices could erase the fact that organisms in her backyard did not match the world's books. The fact did not depend on opinion. Weeks stretched. Reports refined. External labs repeated results and reached the same conclusion: anomalies consistent with an undocumented species. That phrase hit her like a bell. Undocumented species. It sounded clinical and cautious, but she heard music beneath it. The triumphant whisper that the lights in her water carried real names about to be given by careful mouths. Even then, the laughter surged. So what? It's still algae. Just algae we haven't complained about yet. One neighbor declared it loudly at the post office, winning a small chorus of nods. Another laughed at her in the grocery store parking lot. "Guess you'll sell pond tours, charge $5 to see swamp slime." She loaded her groceries quietly, heart bruised yet beating strong with the steady truth in her pocket. Her resilience surprised even herself. She found no need to shout back. Let them sneer. Each insult sounded more desperate to her ears, the tone of people clinging to disbelief when change pressed closer than they wanted. She thought of it like thunder before clarity, a loud noise that couldn't stop morning light. When the researchers mailed her printed drafts of their findings, she framed a copy with care, hanging it near the window. The pages filled with graphs and images, words dense and precise. Scientific language didn't read like poetry, yet to her it sang. The spiral structures captured under scope, the phrases like distinct protein signatures, were verses carved in ink. So she woke each morning to that curtain of ridicule outside her gate and still walked barefoot into the yard, toes pressing the cool grass, eyes falling on the rippling water. Laughter, yes, still. But now also whispers from beyond town. Scientists emailing, journalists circling, interest growing. Proof had entered the stage. Laugh all they wanted, proof didn't leave once it arrived. It stayed. It multiplied in labs. It hardened into certainty. The pond had spoken in whispers for so long. Now its truth was echoing in reports and labs far away. And though the community tried desperately to bury her in ridicule, they were already losing. Because every scientist who studied the light, every graph that confirmed distinction, chipped away at scoffs. Skeptics could call it algae until their throats ran dry. But data carries more weight than laughter ever can. In that balance, she finally felt herself tipping. She didn't need to argue. She needed only to keep her pond. The rest would settle on its own. By the time the first official findings were whispered through scientific circles, her backyard no longer felt like a secret haven. Lantern light had given way to daylight cameras. Strangers with badges clipped to shirts began to walk the same paths her neighbors once mocked. The pond, that had been dismissed as a swamp, now hummed with the quiet bustle of teams setting up tripods, jotting notes in thick binders, adjusting lenses, and checking equipment. It startled her at first. The sudden shift from isolation to invasion left her uneasy. Where she had once sat alone with a thermos of tea, watching fireflies skim the surface, she now had to share space with visitors who spoke in technical tones she couldn't always follow. Yet somewhere beneath the unease sat a pulse of relief. The pond was no longer her solitary burden. The hidden life within its waters had stepped into light. Journalists were among the first outsiders to arrive, chasing hints of novelty. At the town diner, patrons rolled their eyes. She conned the city papers now? Next thing you know, she'll be on TV claiming mermaids. Their light laughter spilled like it always had, but even it cracked with nervousness. The difference now was clear. People with microphones were not laughing. They were recording. Small crews camped at her gate, asking gently for comment. She kept her words modest. "It's their work that matters," she'd murmur, nodding toward scientists. But photos of her, standing barefoot by the water with notebooks tucked beneath one arm, soon spread. Headlines ran with contrasting tones, some mocking, some amazed. Backyard pond draws researchers. Swamp woman sparks debate. The language hinged between dismissal and awe, but either way, the world was looking, and that changed everything in the neighborhood. For so long, the nearest houses had held firm in ridicule. They joked about swamp tours and mosquito labs. Now, when vehicles with university logos appeared, when television vans parked on the street, the neighbors fell to hushed speculation. One muttered, "Why her yard?" Another grumbled, "It could have been us." Their laughter grew thinner, giving way to glances pulled quickly aside. What had once defined them, mockery, was replaced by something heavier, envy. She sensed it in the way their eyes lingered when she walked down her porch steps alongside researchers in pressed shirts. Their scorn was warping, bending first into disbelief, then curling at the edges into resentment that she of all people, the quiet loner with an unkempt yard, was suddenly the center of attention. But she paid it little mind. Each day she focused on the pond. Technicians lowered sensors on slim cords, mapping temperature gradients. Biologists made sketches of ecosystem balance. Photographers captured faint light rippling under the surface. What to her had always been mystery, spoken only in notebooks and whispers, was now evidence framed in professional hands. The first national scientists arrived with equipment larger than anything the local students had carried. Boxes of cables, sealed cases for samples, microscopes balanced on tables under white tents. Their voices carried accents from faraway states, infusing her yard with a new rhythm. One afternoon, a tall man leaned close to her and said softly, "This is remarkable." If confirmed, it could mean evolutionary divergence overlooked until now. For her, those words resonated beyond science. They validated years of loneliness endured among smirks and giggles. In quieter moments, she stepped back, overwhelmed. Photographers knelt where she once sat, capturing ripples. The steady hum of recorders replaced the mocking calls of swamp lady. Vehicles lined the street. Reporters asked neighbors for comment. Some dodged, embarrassed by their earlier ridicule. Others still muttered scorn, clinging desperately to the story they had told themselves for years. But the tides had shifted. The pond, once a punchline, had become news. It wasn't easy. Crowds pressed. Journalists sometimes shouted questions, as if pressing her into sound bites. She longed for still mornings when only insects stirred the air. Yet she kept reminding herself the pond's truth belonged here, not locked in ridicule forever. If noise was the price of truth being heard, she would bear it. The hardest moments came not from reporters, but from those who had once sneered, and now struggled to hide their interest. A woman who'd ridiculed her loudly at barbecues appeared at her fence pretending concern. "Well, maybe you were onto something after all," she said thinly. The words sounded less like apology and more like envy. The woman's eyes darted toward the clusters of equipment, settling hungrily on the scientist's every gesture. She nodded politely, feeling no need to answer. Secrets she once carried had already spoken for themselves. No neighborly detour could change that. The global scientific press soon stretched the story further. Journals referenced unnamed pond organisms under review. Public radio programs aired snippets describing possible discovery of new microbial life in an unexpected place. Each mention added fuel to the gathering storm. Standing by her fence one evening, she watched the sunset blaze across lenses while two journalists filmed their live segment. Their voices rose. Outside this quiet home, potential groundbreaking discovery may be redefining biology as we know it. She glanced at her pond, still modest, still lined with crooked stones, as if amused by the exaggeration. She whispered to herself, "Calm down. You're still the same water," yet inside her, awe shivered like light itself. By then, children no longer shouted, "Swamp Lady," as they pedaled past. They slowed deliberately, peering through slats, remembering instead to ask, "Is that where the scientists are working?" Adults who once mocked began slipping questions in under veneers of politeness. So, what exactly did they find? Strained smiles replaced ridicule. The balance had tipped enough that disdain now risked embarrassment. She realized then that laughter had always been a shield, neighbor protecting themselves from ideas that challenged the ordinary. But as proof hardened, laughter cracked, and behind it revealed something rawer. Awe mingled with jealousy, curiosity veined with regret. One night, she sat quietly by the water as distant cameras packed away. Lanterns glowed under the tents. Ripples spread in subtle circles. She thought of the long path here, the days digging dirt under ridicule, the months noting glimmers alone, the sting of gossip that once cut so sharply, the first surreal validation from a stranger crouching by her water. Now, all those threads had braided into this moment. Journalists at the fence, scientists scribbling phrases that would soon be published, neighborhoods holding their laughter too tight for comfort. The pond had moved from private solace to shared stage. Its truth was no longer hidden. The world was watching, even if the world did not quite know what it was seeing yet. And in those ripples, she found herself no longer small. The odd woman with a swamp had become the quiet figure center stage in something larger than ridicule could ever contain. And as the last light faded that evening, she whispered toward the pond, "They're finally seeing you." By the time official confirmation came, her life felt like it had been lived in two worlds. One of long, lonely evenings, clutching her notebook beside water mocked as swamp. And another, crowded with voices carrying questions and cameras. But then came the moment that shattered the divide. The final analysis arrived from a national lab, independent, rigorous, undeniable. The organisms in her pond were confirmed as a new species, not algae, not bacteria, something singular, something unrecorded in the vast biological catalogs of the world. She received the news not in a press conference or among crowds, but in a quiet knock at her door. A student she now considered almost family held a folder close to his chest. His eyes brimmed with excitement. He handed her the pages and whispered, "It's official." She read slowly, her heart bending under the weight of each phrase. Genetic divergence established. Morphological novelty confirmed. Recommendation: classification as new species. Her knees trembled. She sank into a chair, clutching the folder as though it pulsed with life itself. For months, she had stared into dark water, hearing only laughter beyond her fence. Now, typed letters from scientists carved those jeers into silence. And yet, silence did not follow. It cracked across the community in awkward shifts. Some neighbors avoided her gaze, busying themselves with yard work when she stepped outside. Others attempted stiff courtesy. One man, who had once shouted "Swamp Lady" loud enough to echo down the street, muttered as they crossed paths, "Congratulations, I guess." The words were rough, reluctant, but they marked something new. No longer ridicule, no longer safe dismissal, only begrudging recognition. She allowed herself no revenge. She didn't gloat, didn't call back reminders of their mockery. Instead, she simply smiled softly and continued on her path. Vindication wasn't about shouting louder. It was about knowing the truth had taken root despite scorn. At the pond, she sat quietly, elbows on knees, letting the late sun scatter over ripples. The water reflected faint threads of the glow that had started it all. She whispered, "They know you now." For the first time, relief flooded her body without the constant drag of doubt. It wasn't just her against laughter. It wasn't just her notebooks against gossip. The world had borne witness. The media, once skeptical, shifted overnight. Headlines now read, "Backyard pond yields new species." Global coverage painted her first as eccentric, now as pioneer. Though scientists rightly took credit for rigorous work, they never forgot to note how it began, with a patient woman, keeping logs by lantern light in a yard where neighbors laughed. Her name threaded through articles not as mockery, but as the unlikely origin of discovery. And with that change in language, the tone of her community fractured. People she hadn't spoken to in years appeared at her gate offering stilted apologies. "We didn't understand," one woman said, her voice low, almost ashamed. Another shuffled feet and mumbled, "Guess we were wrong." Their words couldn't erase months of pain, but she accepted them with a quiet nod. Vindication didn't need to punish. It needed only to stand unshaken. What struck her most wasn't the apologies, though, but the silence. The laughter that once rolled effortlessly across lawns now fell flat. Days passed without anyone calling her names. Even children, coached by ridicule long before, now pedaled by with wide eyes, whispering instead, "That's the pond." The absence of mockery sounded louder to her than the jeers ever had. Yet vindication also carried weight. Reporters lingered, curious about how it felt to be proven right. She answered softly, "It feels like the pond always knew. I just had to listen long enough." Her humility surprised interviewers, expecting theatrics. They didn't see vanity in her, only deep gratitude. Gratitude to water that had cradled life unseen. Gratitude for stillness that protected wonder until others were ready to see. Inside her home, beneath the framed pages of those early reports, she felt both joy and sorrow. Joy that truth had bloomed. Sorrow for the loneliness endured to reach it. Nights of doubt, waking to laughter, clinging to fragile notes, these could never be erased. Vindication wasn't simply triumph. It was acknowledgement that she had lived through ridicule for something precious beyond herself. Scientists continued their work, cataloging proteins, mapping evolutionary links. They invited her to conferences, offered her seats at lectures. She declined most. What she wanted wasn't stages or lights, but quiet hours at the very pond where it all began. To sit and feel the breath of reeds, to hear the soft ripple of water that once sounded like a language no one else could hear. The neighbors noticed her calmness and wrestled with their own discomfort. Some now tried too hard, offering baked goods or cheerful greetings. Others still kept distance, ashamed or envious. She sensed both emotions layered in their gestures, but she carried none of it in return. Her vindication ran deeper than their shifting moods. It ran into the water itself, into the organisms glowing softly beneath. One evening, near dusk, she hosted for the first time not journalists or scientists, but a handful of children curious enough to ask. She let them kneel at the pond's edge. They gasped as faint lights stirred in water, their faces reflected in ripples. She told them, for so long people laughed. But look, the pond was always alive, with something waiting to be seen. Their wonder felt like balm on the scars of mockery. A new generation, starting from awe instead of scorn. Vindication carried unexpected echoes. She no longer needed to prove herself. The pond had done that, measured in labs and confirmed in reports. But what it gave her most was peace. She finally sat without the heavy knot of defense in her chest. She could breathe again by the water, knowing the laughter had dissolved into nothing but memory. The quiet made her stronger, not weaker. She reflected that had she crumbled under ridicule, had she filled the pond back in out of shame, the world would have lost this new species. That thought struck hard, not just for herself, but for the very idea that patience and faith can reveal wonders where no one expects them. So she sat by the pond, her notebook closed for once, fingers trailing the grass. The stillness hummed. A glow pulsed faintly beneath. Vindication wasn't a roar, it was a ripple. Spreading, steady, impossible to stop. And she knew with certainty the world had changed because she had not given up when it was hardest to believe. When the rush of cameras eased and the buzz of scientists quieted, she finally had time to sit alone again on her porch. From there, she could see the pond returning to calm, only reeds swaying with the breeze. In the silence after the storm, her thoughts wandered to what all of this really meant. The discovery wasn't the whole story. Her resistance to doubt had been just as vital. Without her patience, without her decision to hold ground when mockery felt endless, this pond's secret could have slipped away, unnoticed and unloved. She thought often of how strange it was that the extraordinary had appeared here, among the ordinary. Her neighborhood was like any other, lawns trimmed in tidy rectangles, mailboxes lined in a row, chores measured in convenience. No one, not even she at first, imagined groundbreaking life waiting in the deepest curve of a small handmade pond. And yet, it was here. Life of a kind unknown to science had bubbled beneath the laughter, carrying mysteries that textbooks had never written. It left her wondering how many other stories were buried in backyards, streams, and forgotten corners of the world. How much ridicule covers over truth, silencing it before it can rise. The thought pressed on her late at night, when the cicadas hushed at once, and all she heard was the clicking whispers of the pond. If she had surrendered, if she had filled the hole after the third taunt at the grocery store, then an entire species would have vanished into nothingness, erased without ever being imagined. Human pride almost buried wonder in the soil of that yard. The scientists echoed her reflections in their own words. One afternoon, a young researcher leaned against the porch rail and said, "Discovery doesn't always live in rainforests or oceans. Sometimes it's hiding under our noses, waiting for someone who refuses to give up." She nodded, struck by how his words gave form to what she had been living for years. In a sense, she realized, her resilience was part of the biology story. The pond's hidden life survived in part because she did too. Neighbors, still uneasy in their adjustments, began speaking cautiously of what had happened. At first, they muttered about luck. She stumbled onto it. But the closer they looked, the harder it became to dismiss the devotion she had given long before recognition arrived. They glanced at her old notebooks, at her patient rituals of listening by lantern light, and slowly, respect replaced pity. It was uneasy respect, clumsy, reluctant, but woven through with something genuine. They saw now that the so-called swamp had demanded more courage than their neat lawns ever had. For her, the larger message was simple yet vast. Extraordinary truths do not announce themselves with grandeur. They wait in quiet, enduring places, and it takes someone willing to absorb disbelief to reveal them. That thought sat like a lodestar in her chest. Each time she poured tea and stared at the pond, she repeated it to herself. Ordinary ground can turn out to be threshold ground, if only someone listens long enough. She reflected, too, on the shape laughter had taken across years. How easy it is for ridicule to mask fear. Her neighbors hadn't really hated her pond. They'd feared what it represented: difference, nonconformity, a life not bent to dull routine. They had wrapped their fear in jokes, because jokes feel safer than awe. But awe demands humility, and humility asks us to admit we don't know as much as we think. That had been the true challenge for them, harder than anything she endured with her shovel. Meanwhile, scientists continued visiting, logging samples, carefully tending the water. They reminded her constantly of how fragile the discovery remained. A shift in balance could wipe out a population not yet studied. She guarded the pond now, not simply as a source of vindication, but as a sanctuary. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about life new to the planet's record, and her duty toward it. Sometimes she compared her journey to the ancient stories she had read as a girl. Explorers stumbling onto hidden caves, sailors sketching shores no map yet held. But the analogy that struck deepest was different. She thought of seeds. Seeds do their work in darkness, ridiculed as nothing more than dirt clinging to shell. until suddenly they break into green. That, she realized, was what her pond had been. For months it had looked like nothing but muck, and then, unseen, the seed cracked open. That reflection gave her a kind of grace toward her neighbors. They had seen only dirt and debris because they couldn't imagine a seed at work. How could they? Mockery had been their way of protecting themselves from wonder they weren't ready for. So she forgave them, quietly, even if they never asked, not because they deserved it, but because she understood. Her reflections widened beyond her yard. What if she spoke to people far away who might be tempted to snuff their strange habits under fear of ridicule? Could her story remind them to persist? She hoped so, because if life waited in her backyard pond, surely hidden truths waited everywhere. In forgotten notebooks, in stubborn gardens, in half-built sketches scrawled on kitchen tables. Mystery isn't rare. Belief is. And belief is what keeps it alive long enough to matter. By early spring, she noticed subtle changes in the community rhythm. No one laughed aloud anymore when passing her gate. Some even slowed their steps, faces etched with reluctant curiosity. The pond had shifted from punchline to landmark, its ripples not dismissed but acknowledged, however quietly. In church basements and grocery aisles, whispers ticked like moth wings. She was right, all along. She didn't need their praise. She needed their understanding. And, slowly, she realized, that was what was arriving, not in grand apologies, but in softened eyes, in children pausing with open wonder, in neighbors pressing lips tight before speaking, as if remembering what cruelty had cost them before. Respect comes not when people clap, but when they finally accept silence in place of laughter. And so she sat each evening by the pond, not triumphant, but contemplative. The reeds bowed against wind, the water shimmered faintly, and she thought longer thoughts, of patience, of persistence, of how ridicule can be survived if you root yourself deep enough in inner conviction. She wondered how many other breakthroughs humanity had lost because someone folded under laughter. She whispered to the water, "You remind me never to give up." Her reflections carried weight, not only for her, but for those who listened when she chose to share. At community events, she spoke sparingly, simply saying, "Sometimes you have to believe in something long enough for it to reveal why it matters." Simple words, yet they lingered in rooms long after she left, because everyone knew her pond, and everyone remembered the laughter that now bound them in embarrassment. In the broader picture, she knew the species itself would take the scientific spotlight. It would eventually be named, catalogued, written into journals. But the hidden truth, just as important, was that ordinary persistence, mocked and dismissed, had been the vessel carrying it forward. Resilience had been as crucial an ingredient as water, as soil, as sunlight slipping through reeds. Even as fame brushed her name, her personal reflections kept her humble. She hadn't been chosen by fate as much as she had chosen not to quit. That mattered more, because giving up would have been easy. Every jeer had been an invitation to cover the pond back up, to erase it, to conform. She had chosen differently. In that choice lived the meaning of it all. That choice was why, today, the world had one more glimpse into life's strange capacity to surprise us. It would be written up as a new species, but to her, it was proof that where others ridicule, Hidden truths may already be stirring. The pond looked smaller now compared to the flood of attention it had brought, but to her it only seemed deeper. Sitting cross-legged by the water on a quiet evening, she let her eyes follow the slow circle of ripples drifting outward. The reeds bent lazily against the breeze. Birds called from the wires overhead, and the neighborhood, once full of laughter and ridicule, was hushed. It was a hush earned, not by silencing others, but by waiting long enough for truth to rise on its own. She ran her palm over the weathered notebook resting beside her. Pages filled with crooked sketches, times scribbled in half-dark, moments when she wasn't sure if she believed herself. Inside those lines remained the record of the hardest months of her life, but they were also proof of her perseverance. She whispered into the open air, as if speaking to the pond itself. "We made it through." A glimmer pulsed beneath the surface, faint but steady. She leaned forward and smiled. It wasn't rare anymore, not to her, not to scientists who now logged such pulses on instruments, but it still held wonder. The glow reminded her of how she had once crouched here in silence, trembling at lights she couldn't explain. Now, the same glow sat calmly under surface tension, acknowledged, protected, and celebrated for what it was. Word had spread far beyond her yard. The species had been granted a formal classification, a name she repeated quietly but never publicly, as though it was a shared secret. The pond itself was now officially protected by conservation order, watched not only by her, but by visiting specialists who ensured its balance remained intact. What was once mocked as a swamp had become a sanctuary. She thought about that transformation daily, not just of the water, but of herself. Once, a woman clinging to projects for companionship, dismissed by neighbors as odd, she now sat here with a sense of profound peace. The victory was never about headlines or being proven right. It was about enduring. She had survived ridicule, isolation, the temptation to give in, and by surviving, she made space for something that the world never knew it needed. Still, she didn't allow fame or attention to swell inside her. When reporters returned, asking for personal updates, she spoke gently and briefly before returning to her quiet routines. She didn't miss the spotlight when it faded again. That left more silence for her and the pond. What mattered to her was that the laughter had stopped, that children leaned curiously over reeds instead of jeering, that her neighbors paused with embarrassed smiles instead of taunts. Vindication had softened into quiet belonging. Sometimes she imagined what those neighbors must feel now. Perhaps regret clanged loud in them. Perhaps pride wouldn't let them confess how badly they had underestimated her. She carried no anger about it anymore. Watching the water, she felt pity instead. Pity that they wasted so much of their breath guarding themselves against awe. They built fences against wonder. She dug a hole and filled it with water. One path led to ridicule, the other to discovery. The evenings gave her the clearest clarity. With tea warming her hands, she settled into the porch chair and listened for the faint hums. Once, they filled her with fear of being thought mad. Now, they filled her with certainty that hidden truths rarely come loudly. They live in quiet, unassuming places, whispering until someone finally proves patient enough to listen. Before bed each night, she walked the pond's edge. She trailed fingertips across reeds, as though to say goodnight. That ritual gave her stillness, a reminder that the story wasn't hers alone, but belonged to the life she had sheltered. She often thought of herself not as discoverer, but as caretaker, chosen by accident, perhaps by stubbornness, perhaps by chance, perhaps by something deeper. But she accepted the role with gratitude that couldn't be measured in any journal. The broader world moved on, of course. Other discoveries filled headlines. New studies carried attention elsewhere. Yet here, tucked in her backyard, an extraordinary world pulsed beneath a calm surface. A world that owed its survival to nothing more than faith and refusal to quit. She smiled at that thought, because she knew in her bones that countless others might stand in similar places, carrying secrets mocked by neighbors, tempted to give up. Her story might be their reminder not to surrender, not to let ridicule erase a possible wonder. She leaned forward one last time and let her reflection ripple on the water. For years, she remembered, she saw her reflection here as a woman alone. Now she saw something else. Partnership. The lines on her face, the reeds bending behind, the faint glow shimmering upward, they blended into one picture. A portrait of persistence, patience, and truth breaking through disbelief. The pond no longer needed her defense. It had its own guardians now, in scientists, in laws, in records. And yet she remained its truest witness, the first to see light beneath, the only one who knew what it felt like to believe before anyone else dared to. That memory, that private knowledge, was hers forever. One night, sitting cross-legged again by its edge, she whispered words that couldn't be heard by anyone but the water. "You saved me, as much as I saved you." She never explained it aloud, but she knew it was true. Building the pond had carried her through loneliness. Protecting it had given her purpose. Enduring for it had given her strength. Together, they had waited out the noise of mockery. Together, they proved what patience can reveal. When the glow flickered once more in the stillness, she breathed deeply and closed her eyes. For the first time, she felt no weight at all, only a calm gratitude. Her journey was not about winning against neighbors or proving doubters wrong. It was about proving that hidden truths can survive if someone believes long enough to hold space for them. She sat back, eyes on the soft ripples, hand resting on her notebook. Around her, the night thickened with stillness, the pond shimmering faintly like a mirror holding secrets. She smiled with quiet conviction. In the stillness of the water, a whole new world had waited to be seen. Stay with me for more strange and unexpected stories. If this one stirred something in you, subscribe for the next journey, because the ordinary world is full of mysteries, waiting only for someone willing to listen.